That is an important message. All those parties have ruled out governing together with the AfD. That is a very sceptic, anti-Europe, anti-immigration party. But then it comes down to the interesting race of who will actually succeed Angela Merkel as Chancellor. And there we're looking at something where the SPD, for the first time in post-war Germany, is not playing a role at the moment. It is going to be between the Conservatives and the Greens. And so, you know, maybe we'll have a young Green woman Chancellor, but of course she will also have to find some sort of a coalition partner, and here is where the SPD could ultimately still play a role.
So a lot of mathematics being played with all of
but
this.
It will be interesting.
Yeah, Nina Haase, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Let's go to sports now, and in German football, Bayern Munich are Bundesliga champions for a record 9th time in a row. Their title was confirmed before they had even kicked the ball on Saturday as Dortmund beat second-place Leipzig earlier in the day. It means Bayern have wrapped things up with 2 games remaining. That saw the champions in party mood as they destroyed Mönchengladbach 6-0. You're watching DW News from Berlin. Up next, doc film Manufacturing Ignorance. We'll have more news headlines at the top of the hour. There's more on our website, dw.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at DW News. I am Eddie Micah Jr. Thanks for watching.
Do you feel worried about the planet? Me too. I'm Neil, host of the On the Green Fence podcast, and to me it's clear we need to change. Join me for a deep dive into the green transformation. For me, for you, for the planet.
The 21st century human world is insatiable, with a constant demand for more technology, more convenience and comfort, more products on more shelves. A lifestyle that also raises a growing number of issues. What exactly is happening in the fields and farms that feed us? And in our medication? Has industrialization turned our world toxic? It's an issue of growing global concern. Citizens on the streets accuse industry of hiding the truth from us. As the corporations defend and deny, how are we to judge which side is right? So we turn to science, asking researchers to be the arbiters of this argument. Surely they should know best. Except that scientists who do step into the fray are then themselves targeted and are subject to influence, corruption, and infiltration.
We're living in a world where there are many people who have a vested interest in fighting information, fighting scientific evidence, and discrediting even the notion that science could provide the truth about the natural world.
They are intentionally seeking to derail science.
The first step is to identify these attacks and then expose the machinations of those trying to stand in the way of knowledge.
And in that context, it's essential for us to understand who these people are, what they do, why they do it, and how they do it.
And we have to understand how it is that the public sometimes participates in the spreading of this deliberate ignorance. So we need to visit this landscape of manufactured ignorance.
Like most of the developed world, northern Greece has seen a collapse of bee colonies. A phenomenon that's been observed since the 1990s, it's become a textbook case for the manufacture of confusion and culturally induced ignorance. Here too, it began with an enigma, with experts unable to explain what was happening and why.
It was a complete mystery. Why were so many bees suddenly dying?
TV reports showed beekeepers in complete despair. Then a suspect was found, a new generation of insecticides in our fields, the latest innovation of the agrochemical industry.
Products containing multiple active ingredients. Every Syngenta formulation is the result of years of careful investigation and thorough research by our scientists.
A coincidence that bees started dying in their millions once these new products were being sprayed on our crops?
Which is why, very quickly, suspicion started falling in that direction.
Could scientists solve the case? Fani Hajina has been searching for the truth in research at her beehives and in the lab.
We scientists, with the help of beekeepers, must find the answer.
What began as scientific research soon became a game of cat and mouse. Normally, scientists have the peace and quiet of their labs to examine data from field studies. The mass death of bees is just one of many phenomena experts have been asked to explain. Traditionally, science has the role of highlighting natural mechanisms and reaching an explanation for the slightest observable fact. This is how science normally progresses, by solving more and more mysteries. And in principle, our knowledge of the world we live in increases. However, this fine principle sometimes has a few hiccups. For scientific observers, the case of the vanishing bees is emblematic of this.
With something like bees and pesticides, you should have been able to investigate it by collecting data, by following the evidence where it's taking you.
The crux of the idea is that when we find the evidence that tells us what's happening, we tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and we let the chips fall where they may. We commit, in a way, sort of, committing to accepting the truth of those findings.
But in the case of the bees, that truth took a different course. In the early 2000s, countless official reports pointed to the toxic effect of even very low doses of neonicotinoids on bees. And yet, 20 years on, there is no universally accepted truth, no consensus on the link between these pesticides and the disappearance of bees. What explains that divergence? You need to be a very shrewd observer to see the whole picture.
The moment the bee problem appeared, there was 4 to 5 times more research into causes not linked to pesticides. Natural pathogens like Varroa, Nosema, and different viruses, but also bad beekeeping practices, climate change, the loss of habitat, night lighting, the Asian hornet, and other invasive species like the small hive beetle. Basically, research was much more intensive in causes unlinked to pesticides than into pesticides themselves.
As is shown with a quick search in a scientific study database. As soon as pesticides were suspected, there was a dramatic rise in the number of public and private studies focusing on alternative explanations. 2010, the veterinary authorities were confused.
Il n'y a pas de conclusion, ni dans un sens, ni dans l'autre. On ne peut pas conclure. Je ne peux pas le faire. Et je pense que personne aujourd'hui ne peut le faire.
The more studies there were, the less beekeepers could make sense of it all. It seemed like a paradox, until researchers discovered similarities in an older case.
When you see a flourishing of new studies emerge in any particular area, a little bit ironically, it creates the appearance of being dedicated to pursuing the truth. But it takes me directly back to the case of big tobacco.
It's what's up front that counts. And up front ahead of the filter,
In the 1950s, tobacco still enjoyed the image of a completely harmless stimulant.
Filter blend. Filter blend means fine tobacco for the best taste yet.
But that carefree attitude would not last.
What does this product contain? Scientists.
In December 1953, the tobacco industry was in big trouble. Researchers had found that painting mice with tar from cigarettes caused cancer, a revelation that sparked an embittered controversy.
The tobacco companies had a real crisis because they can't contest the evidence and say it's wrong. They can just say, we don't know. And so the leaders of all the major cigarette companies got together in New York City.
A meeting subsequently took place at New York's Plaza Hotel between the bosses of the 7 major manufacturers, collectively known as Big Tobacco. Imagine the scene.
Gentlemen, let's get right to the heart of the matter.
The meeting would go down in the annals of ignorance.
It is a challenge to every one of us, and we are all in this together, unified.
In light of this threat to business, the corporations came up with a plan.
They launched this campaign in which they said, you know, we're aware of this science, we think there are problems with it, and it's a matter of deep concern to us.
Now we are beginning a campaign to spell out that basic point, so that no one will fail to get it.
They decided to make a public statement.
We are pledging aid and assistance to the research effort into all phases of tobacco use and health. For this purpose, we are establishing a joint tobacco industry group, the Tobacco Industry Research Committee.
Good statement. Yes.
The press published the declaration, Tobacco Industry to Start Scientific Research.
Believe me, friends, Chesterfield has for your smoking pleasure and protection every advantage known to modern science.
Chesterfield gives you scientific facts.
The opening of a centre of research on tobacco didn't aim to further knowledge, but to produce knowledge that would disprove established facts. So they were using scientific methods to refute established science.
It's really using science against itself.
The explicit use of science against science, I think, does represent a kind of watershed. To systematically fund scientific research in order to undermine science, effectively fighting fire with fire, that's a watershed moment.
So after they decided this, how did they operationalize it? One of the things that tobacco companies funded a lot of was what I call distracting research.
The labs backed by the cigarette manufacturers set up research projects known as Special Projects, or SPs, an entire arsenal geared to diverting scientific findings. They covered lung cancer in non-smokers, for example, looking for links to residence, working conditions, and personal habits. They experimented on rabbits to see if lung cancer might be caused by toxins or viruses. As Big Tobacco generously financed hundreds of studies. Some proved useful, such as research into the precursors of cardiovascular disease. But other studies bordered on the absurd, such as contact with egg yolk or tomato juice allegedly leading to skin tumors, or the link between lung cancer and baldness, or even between cancer and the month of birth, with March supposedly putting you at greater risk.
The idea is to say there are all kinds of causes. It is to spread ignorance by clouding the issue with a multitude of data.
Drawing suspicion to other potential culprits is an effective strategy, especially as lung cancer could be attributed to a combination of factors. Identifying a range of risk factors and pursuing multiple avenues of research is perfectly normal in science, but it can also be extremely handy for creating confusion. It then becomes almost impossible to determine the true guilty party, and that's the point.
That's extremely well understood, and that designed the playbook for pretty much every other science denial that has followed.
This is a story about tobacco. This is a story about acid rain. This is a story about the ozone hole. This is a story about pesticides. This is a story about climate change. Neonicotinoids, bisphenol A, contraceptive pills. I mean, we have now seen this strategy used over and over and over again. It's about buying time.
Sadly, it's a winning strategy.
In the case of tobacco, it's 70 years already, and it's still going.
In the case of the dying bees, scientific insights have likewise been deliberately suppressed.
With all that's gone on, I'd say we've wasted 20 to 30 years.
So we're talking about decades of disinformation and decades of delay.
In the meantime, the companies are still making gobs of money.
But eventually, a scientific lie constructed over several decades can start to develop cracks. 40 years after the first alerts on tobacco, a humble employee in the US turned whistleblower and changed everything. A box of documents was sent to the University of San Francisco. Professor Stanton Glantz was in for a surprise that day.
On May 12, 1994, a box of documents landed in my office from an anonymous source. These were internal documents from at the very highest levels of the tobacco industry. They're senior scientists, they're senior lawyers, they're senior management, they're senior public relations people, talking very, very frankly about what they knew about the dangers of smoking.
The documents were an unexpected treasure trove for the professor.
It was like a new world, stumbling into a new world.
As the leaked documents increased in number, the truth broke, and the tobacco bosses were cornered.
Gentlemen, the recent disclosure of documents have shaken my confidence that your companies care about the truth. These documents suggest possible manipulation of scientific research by industry attorneys. If these things are true, then you should know that this kind of behavior is unacceptable and will not be allowed.
Faced with damning evidence, the corporations were forced to make decades of secret archives public.
And the collection, which started out a few thousand pages, is now up around 93 million pages.
These documents are now kept at the University of San Francisco archives. They contain the details of a massive manipulation of science, the tactics deployed, the researchers recruited, and the sums of money involved. Among the documents was an internal memo from 1969 that summed up the strategy of the tobacco industry.
Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy.
The key strategy is the creation of doubt about science. Doubt is a perfect weapon. It's effective, but also pernicious, because doubt is legitimately part of science. In fact, it's an essential driver of science. We investigate things because we have questions about them, because we're curious, or because we doubt the existing explanation is adequate. So we need doubt in science.
The word doubt is key to science. We always say science doubts. But there are two types of science. Established science, where we no longer question that the Earth is round or that apples fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. Galileo measured it. We can measure it again, but it won't change the result. Here, there is no doubt. Doubt exists in ongoing science, in what we're studying, in proposing hypotheses. So the strategy of doubt is about saying that established, accepted science is still subject to doubts.
So what the tobacco industry did was to take a virtue and turn it into a vice.
The use of scientific method against science itself, and spreading skepticism through disinformation. But this mass of revelatory documents, in turn, inspired a new field of study.
How many of you before this week knew something about the history of tobacco? Yeah, most people. Okay.
Naomi Oreskes shows her students how to identify the methods used in historical obstructions of science.
The discovery of this long history of deception has led to a new field of intellectual study, a new academic field, and it's called agnotology, and that means the study of ignorance.
Agnotology is an unconventional field of study, as academics attempt to unravel the main springs of our ignorance, to look into what we don't know.
We were laughed at first because people thought it was not academic to study the absence of knowledge, to study ignorance. But I think people are laughing a bit less now and starting to be a bit worried because we sense and they realize how pervasive the problem might be.
What are the obstacles to knowledge? A question of growing relevance, prompting those who study ignorance to find a public voice.
But over the course of this talk, I'll introduce different ways of thinking about ignorance, and particularly this phrase, strategic ignorance. We're going to ask you to think about examples in your own life of strategic ignorance.
A new understanding of ignorance is emerging. Until now, ignorance meant not knowing what we might know one day thanks to research. But now, we're beginning to see that you can actively produce ignorance.
The issue now is identifying obstacles to our knowledge, things that halt the progress of science, deliberately or not. Perhaps in some cases, it's about what we prefer not to know. Unraveling all that is no mean feat, which is why agnotology, the study of ignorance, needs to progress methodically.
And it's a fascinating field of inquiry with contributions from psychology, sociology, history, political science, cognitive science, computer science, network science. There are lots of disciplines involved that can help us understand how ignorance is being manufactured and how we can protect ourselves against it.
Agnotology is still in its early days and has a lot of ground to make up. The generation of strategic ignorance is being constantly perfected. And debunking it often means plunging into the details of scientific practice. There's a constant stream of innovations on the market, accompanied by a fair share of scrutiny. Are they a threat to our health? And more importantly, what are safe levels? That's the big question, the one at the heart of a fierce dispute. One such dispute began in this laboratory one day in 1989. Carlos Sonnenschein and Ana Soto are both biologists. For years, they had been trying to solve the mystery of cellular proliferation in cancer. Suddenly, before their very eyes, some control cells cultivated in a test tube began to multiply for no discernible reason.
It was a real Sherlock Holmes investigation, trying to find out where it came from, because that is the first thing you have to do, identify what is the source.
They reviewed each piece of lab equipment. After 4 months of growing suspense, they finally had their culprit: the centrifuge tubes. They contained a material that should have been inert but wasn't. The plastic additive in question contained and dispersed a substance that acted like the hormone estrogen.
Carlos and I were very disturbed by this finding.
We thought that this was a big deal.
The question now was, what other products might contain the substance? Toys? Disposable bottles? food packaging? And in all the plastics that end up in the environment? And what impact does it have on our organism?
The big question is establishing the doses to which the public can be exposed without a major risk to our health. And that question really is the mother of all battles.
The impact of product X on our health is studied by toxicologists. The accepted rule is centuries old. It's simple and seemingly makes good sense. The effect is proportionate to the quantity consumed. It's true for sugar and fats and applies to pretty much any product. The golden rule of toxicology says the dose makes the poison, which by extension means that anything below that level isn't a poison. According to this rule, a plastic with the characteristics of a hormone that ends up in a baby's mouth shouldn't pose any problem, because the quantity of synthetic estrogen ingested is minuscule. True or false? This is the crux of the controversy.
An experiment was carried out at the University of Missouri by a researcher called Fred von Saal. He was the first to carry out a controlled experiment on lab animals to try to evaluate the activity of a common plastic called bisphenol A.
This has the structure of an estrogenic drug. They are using a sex hormone to make plastic. This is insane.
Professor Frederick von Saal and his team spent years observing mice exposed to different doses of bisphenol A. To measure traces of the product, they explored what happens at the limits of detection using ultra-sensitive machines. And what they discovered sent shockwaves through the scientific community.
In fact, the damage to the reproductive system was occurring at 25,000 times below what had been considered a dose that would cause no effect. We were absolutely shocked.
This was huge for several reasons. The most important being that some of these substances can have bigger effects at tiny doses than with stronger doses. And why is that important? Because regulatory toxicology tests the harmfulness of these molecules at high doses and never tests, or extremely rarely, tests the harmfulness of these molecules at the tiny doses to which humans are generally exposed.
Except that at low doses, instead of acting like a typical poison, bisphenol A is an endocrine disruptor. It alters our hormones, the molecules that regulate, among other things, our reproductive system. Even in the tiniest observable doses, it can have devastating effects. In other words, researchers began to come across some very unexpected relationships between the dose and the effect of a product. And this was shaking up the world of toxicologists.
We were rejecting their dogma.
The toxicology community have not accepted it.
They said, we reject this.
The resistance among toxicologists was understandable. It was also convenient for the manufacturers of plastics.
It's not always that people intentionally want to derail science. Some people, unwittingly, through no fault of their own, can at times be pawns in other people's efforts to produce strategic ignorance.
At the same time, the plastics industry gives financial backing to alternative studies, which its representatives use to defend their simple thesis that low doses cannot be dangerous.
More than 100 independent studies have shown that real-life exposure to BPA is about 1,000 times below the safe intake limit set by FDA.
I'm saying one thing, industry is saying another, and there needed to be explanations of how the difference was occurring.
Eager to understand, von Saal collected studies published on the subject, and as a true agnotologist, he set about explaining the disparity in their conclusions.
During that time, I didn't get a lot of sleep. I drank a lot of coffee.
Yes.
His conclusion? 93% of publicly funded studies indicated harmful effects at very low doses of bisphenol A, in contrast to none of the studies financed by the industry. He eventually discovered the primary reason for this difference. Instead of an outright lie, some creative trickery in the private sector labs.
They put a lot of time and effort into figuring out how do we do a study that shows no effects of this chemical.
The first step is to find the right test animal model, using catalogs of laboratory mice and rats, which can be chosen according to their biological parameters. They can be customized to fit the requirements of the relevant experiment and are then dispatched directly to the researcher's lab.
The industry groups were using a very strange animal to try to show that bisphenol A caused no harm.
If you are interested in showing that bisphenol A is not estrogenic, you would select a strain of rat in which bisphenol A does not become an estrogenic compound.
So you have to be very careful about the model you choose, because you can choose the wrong model. And you can choose the wrong model because you don't know, or you can choose the model because you know too well.
How can you do this?
Test rats tailor-made to manipulate the results and prove the innocence of bisphenol A. Another successful trick by the illusionists of science. So the most insidious offensives are hidden in the details. Research protocols, for example, that outline the planning of a study and are delicately put in place. It only takes one corrupted protocol or a broken rule to stall scientific progress.
What's at stake here is evidence-based policymaking. Whether policy is based on the best available evidence or whether policy is designed to satisfy a particular industry in their pursuit of profit.
The manufacturers of ignorance have a target: democratically elected politicians who can decide whether a suspect product is banned or authorized.
Nous allons passer au vote de cette proposition de loi.
The moment we give up on evidence-based policymaking, we've given up on democracy.
Il peut être en verre ou en plastique, mais désormais le biberon, c'est sans bisphénol A.
In 2010, the French Parliament outlawed the guilty baby bottles, but the ban was limited to this one single endocrine disruptor, present in one single product, sold in one single country. A small victory, 20 years after the first alarm bells rang. A serious public health issue therefore continues to be covered up. Among the population, we're seeing a sharp increase in metabolic disorders, such as obesity and diabetes, hormone-sensitive cancers, neurobehavioral disorders, and infertility. In this proliferation of symptoms, endocrine disruptors are the prime suspects, due to our exposure to them. Nevertheless, the defenders of the plastics industry continue to sow doubt.
The presence of a chemical in your body does not mean it's harmful.
Such affirmations are spread on the internet.
Yes, BPA is safe.
The internet is host to a great many organizations with no apparent links to industry that tell us about everything from bisphenol A and energy sources to the disappearance of bees, the climate, food supplements, animal welfare, and fracking. Online, made-to-measure science is rampant. And the target on this front is the general public, us and our opinions. These days, we can weigh in with the click of a mouse on everything from pro or anti-diesel, homeopathy or vaping. We click on like, we tweet or retweet. This is now public opinion. Anonymous yet global, social networks seem to be the ideal forum for disinformation. Global opinion making is among the issues being monitored inside this building in Paris. The Complex Systems Institute brings together mathematicians, IT experts, and data specialists. They develop tools to analyze the muddied waters of social networks. Over 3 months, David Chavalerias and his team analyzed 20 million posts on the climate that originated on Twitter before spreading across the globe. Who is talking to whom? And how do the climate skeptics and their adversaries compete for this virtual space? The team have put together a system that can visualize this sprawling controversy. Each dot represents one person. A line between two people means that one of them has shared the other's post. The more we forward posts, the closer the dots get. Thanks to the program, the dispute over the world's biggest scientific debate becomes apparent.
Here we have all the Twitter accounts that form the community of climate skeptics. You can see that this community is very distinct in terms of sharing the information from the other community, made up of those who agree on the climate consensus. That's 140,000 accounts. That's a lot of people.
Once the debate is rendered observable, what can we conclude?
On the skeptic side, the core is always active. These people never stop tweeting.
There are fewer of them, but they're more active, which means they're trying to counterbalance the debate.
Exactly. They're overactive. Some accounts have 100,000, 200,000 tweets. In 10 years, that's incredible. So this is how they're colonizing Twitter. It's crazy.
A solid core, spreading their arguments on an astronomical scale, a powerful asset for the climate skeptics in this battle for territory, enough to keep their community alive despite the growing evidence. For the scientific community, global warming is indisputable, as is the evident impact of humankind. This consensus, however, does not impose itself on the web.
We see that very regularly, scientific facts prove the climate skeptics' theories wrong, which is potentially dangerous for this community because they can lose members over it. So there's a kind of inoculative reaction. For 2 or 3 days, they'll inundate the social networks with alternative facts and will keep their visibility in a globalized environment. Without social networks, communities of this size wouldn't be able to survive the facts, which so clearly disprove their beliefs.
Conspiracy theories abound on all manner of scientific subjects, with bloggers free to propound their own theories.
The coronavirus, a bioengineered virus, contains nanoparticles that can be activated on a time-phased arrangement by 5G.
Le vaccin et les nanoparticules sont donc injectés simultanément dans votre corps.
Cette pandémie est quelque chose qui a été organisé.
Le crime parfait contre l'humanité.
And we have a cure. They just don't want to give it out.
Amid all the rumors and counter-rumors, some call out a scientific conspiracy and are themselves called out.
Fake news. Share this. I love you being
On social media, it's one side against the other. Are these online arguments supplanting the patient and meticulous approach of science? Has it become to each their own truth?
You know, if I take this pencil and drop it, we have gravity. Okay, that's not a matter of opinion.
Whatever our beliefs, we can't ignore reality. The victims of climate change, the victims of particulate pollution, or those of infectious diseases where people are no longer vaccinated. They are all a grave reminder that ignoring scientific truths has a human cost. In the end, the facts do tend to prevail. And despite the hurdles to progress, our knowledge increases, gradually building up in one way or another through the ages. A few centuries ago, you had to be a mad person to go against common belief and state that the sun and stars don't turn around us, but that the Earth turns round and round like a spinning top. Those who championed this inconvenient truth paid dearly. In Europe, the works of Copernicus were banned. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for life. Their research posed a threat to established beliefs. Another time, another setting. What makes the world go around today is the economy. When the law of the market replaces that of the church, what new limits will be imposed on science? Will this new confrontation decide which research is accepted? Of course, there are cases of researchers being caught in a conflict of interests. The scientist who ceases to remain objective because they're influenced by financial backers. But the grip of the economy on science far outweighs these individual cases. What impact the market has on research can only be gauged if we look at the bigger picture.
The current framework within which science is done hugely influences which science we do.
The market economy frames science in a way that values and privileges science that can be monetized, that is lucrative.
Researchers have to generate money and find it. And so science is turned into a marketplace where everyone is trying to attract attention.
All the labs are basically competing. They have to highlight their specificities and come up with fashionable keywords. In the early 2000s, the magic word was genomic. If you said you worked in genomes, which would vastly influence medicine, you were given millions of dollars. So in 2000, the researcher had to use the word genomic. In 2010, it was nanotechnologies. In 2020, it's artificial intelligence.
Okay, Sophia, I think you're ready.
Current competition is pointing science in a certain direction.
They upgraded my mind a bit. My artificial intelligence. This is too cool. I can walk.
And in the meantime, there are a whole host of unknown fields set aside to fallow.
Deemed less fashionable or less profitable in the short term, certain scientific fields have been deserted.
Some researchers have identified what they call the problem of undone science. Now, that's science that's simply left uninvestigated because there's little commercial imperative in studying it.
Undone science. Science that simply isn't done. The experiment never carried out. The lab that never opened. The epidemiological study that doesn't exist because it was never financed. The scientific books never written. The medical theses never published. These are the vast territories of ignorance which we don't explore because they're not profitable, because we prefer not to know, or because we never even imagined them. Our thirst for knowledge is limitless, and our wonder at science unabated. But science is under threat. A virus spreading, and scientific denial spreading with it.
COVID-19 is not an issue. It's not that lethal. And it's not an issue for many doctors.
As controversies multiply, they cloud our understanding. But there are now scientists beating back the tide of ignorance. There are still only a few, but for us, the general public, they are a new force we can count on. They're developing tools and methods to shed light on ways of protecting a common asset, science, and its meticulous progress.
Africa. Here, clear water comes gargling from the tap. New stations at health clinics are improving hygiene. In Eswatini, clean water has often been in short supply. Now it is flowing from taps across the country, all thanks to solar-powered pumps.
What secrets lie behind these walls? Discover new adventures in 360 degrees and explore fascinating World Heritage sites. DW World Heritage 360. Get the app now. The fight against the coronavirus pandemic. How has the rate of infection been developing? What measures are being taken? What does the latest research say? Information and context. The Coronavirus Update. The COVID-19 Special. Monday to Friday on DW.
This is DW News live from Berlin. Grieving families bury their dead in Afghanistan. Funerals are held for some of the dozens killed in multiple explosions on Saturday, most of them school children. The Taliban denies the government's claim it was responsible. We'll get more from Kabul shortly. Also coming up. No vaccines at all. The WHO warns that nearly a dozen countries, mainly in Africa, have no access to COVID-19 shots. And there are fears that new and concerning variants could emerge from unvaccinated populations. And Olaf Scholz is the Social Democrats' candidate for Chancellor. He's currently Angela Merkel's deputy and is hoping to secure the top job in September. But with the SPD lagging in the polls, does he have any chance at all? Hi, I'm Eddie Micah Jr. Welcome to the program. Families in the Afghan capital, Kabul, have begun burying the victims of Saturday's explosions. More than 50 people, many of them young girls, were killed in the bomb blast at a school in a largely Shia Muslim neighborhood. No group has yet claimed responsibility, but Afghanistan's president is blaming the Taliban. The group has denied the attack, pointing instead the finger at so-called IS.
At a remote hillside cemetery, fathers of those killed in Saturday's attack